Hi guys, tonight we begin in a place where the world feels muffled as if snow itself has decided to turn down the volume. You trudge through powder that squeaks underfoot, the sound sharp and dry in the cold, and every breath rasps slightly as it warms on the way out. Somewhere ahead, half swallowed by drifted white, a trapper's cabin waits. Smoke is faint or absent. That alone tells you something. You pause listening because silence here is never empty. It presses against your ears. You probably will not survive this if you arrive unprepared, and that thought settles in with a calm honesty rather than drama. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you feel like it, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights and step forward with me as the door resists your hand. The hinge complains a low wooden protest, and then the cabin opens. Inside, the air smells of cold ash, old pine and animal fat. It is not a welcoming smell, but it is familiar, and familiarity counts for a lot when winter is deciding terms. You shut the door carefully. Outside, the wind resumes its searching, already testing the seams you have yet to learn. Inside, the dark feels close. Your breath blooms faintly and you can see it. That is your first measure of the night. You take in the space slowly. The cabin is smaller than you imagined, because cabins always are. A low ceiling holds the heat down where you can reach it. Logs are stacked thick, their round ends visible, chinked with moss and clay that have cracked with age. A single window is buried almost entirely by snow, allowing only a dull blue suggestion of the outside world. This kind of cabin was common among North American trappers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, built quickly near trapping grounds and intended to last a few winters at most. That is the mainstream historical reality. These structures were temporary answers to permanent cold. You set down what little you carry. Even that feels deliberate. Every movement cost energy. The floor is uneven, packed earth, worn smooth by boots and time. Somewhere in the dark, a mouse scratches, then goes still. Trappers often tolerated small animals indoors because they produced a little warmth and rarely caused real harm. That is a quirky detail you might not expect, but in winter, tolerance stretches in unusual ways. You listen again. The cabin settles with a sound like a deep breath. You move toward the hearth. It is nothing grand, just a stone-lined firebox with a crude chimney that disappears into the roof. Ashes piled thick. That is a good sign. It means someone understood how to bank a fire, how to let it die slowly instead of burning out all at once. You kneel, fingers stiff, and feel the ash. There is still a suggestion of warmth buried beneath. Relief is not loud. It is a quiet easing in the chest. Outside, the wind slides along the walls. You notice how the sound changes depending on where you stand. Near the door it whispers. Near the corner it hums. This is how you learn a cabin. Not by looking, but by listening. Many trappers wrote casually in journals about learning the voices of their shelters, describing certain sounds as reassuring and others as warnings. Scholars still debate whether these descriptions were practical observations or simply ways to cope with isolation and fear. Either way, the effect is real. You feel less alone when the space begins to speak back. You stand and stretch slowly, joints protesting. The cold has a way of making your body feel older than it is. You brush snow from your coat, careful not to let meltwater drip where it can freeze again later. Moisture is the enemy that arrives quietly. The cabin smells faintly of damp fur. Somewhere a bundle of pelts hangs from a peg, stiff as boards. They rustle slightly when you touch them and the sound is dry and papery. You move to the door again, pressing it closed more firmly, sliding a wooden bar into place. There is no lock in the modern sense. Security here is about discouragement, not impenetrability. Most animals prefer easier opportunities, and most people never come this far in winter. The knowledge is oddly comforting. You're unlikely to be interrupted. You're also unlikely to be rescued if things go wrong. You sit on a low bench and let your breathing slow. The cabin holds the sound of it bouncing it gently back to you. Outside, the snow continues its work softening edges, burying tracks, erasing the path you took to get here. By morning, if there is a morning, you might not find your own footprints. That thought passes through without panic. Panic wastes heat. Calm conserves it. You take inventory. Fire potential. Bedding in the corner a pile of hides and rough blankets that look heavy enough to matter. A pot hanging from a hook, its rim blackened. A tin cup. A rifle resting against the wall close enough to reach without standing. This arrangement appears again and again in historical accounts, not because it was ideal, but because it worked often enough to become tradition. You crouch and coax the fire back to life, slow and patient. Sparks crackle softly. Light blooms against the logs, revealing the grain, the cracks, the careful imperfections. Shadows jump and then settle. The cabin feels smaller now, but also warmer, more defined. You can feel heat on your face and knees, and already your fingers respond. As you sit there waiting for the fire to find its rhythm, you realize something subtle. Sleep tonight will not be about comfort. It will be about management, of heat, of fear, of time. The cabin is not a refuge in the romantic sense. It is a negotiation, and for now the terms are acceptable. You shift closer to the hearth, letting the warmth soak in, knowing that the night has only just begun. The warmth settles slowly, not enough to make you comfortable, but enough to change how the cabin feels around you. You notice it first in your hands. Fingers loosen. Sensation returns in small pulses like distant knocking, finally heard through thick walls. You rub them together once, then stop. Movement generates heat, yes, but it also burns through energy you will want later. Trappers learned early that restraint was as important as effort. As your eyes adjust, you take a more careful look at the cabin itself. It is built low to the ground, almost crouching, as if it expects the wind to shove at it all winter long. There is a practical reason for that. Lower walls mean less surface area exposed to cold air, and a squat shape resists collapse under heavy snow. This design shows up again and again in frontier records. It was not aesthetic. It was stubbornly functional. People who tried taller, roomier cabins often regretted it when storms piled high. You step closer to the wall and press your palm against a log. It is cold, but not painfully so. That matters. Logs this thick act like slow batteries. They absorb heat during the day and release it gradually through the night. The chinking between them is uneven. Moss clay sometimes even strips of cloth shoved into gaps where drafts once screamed through. A perfectly sealed wall was rare. Instead, trappers aimed for good enough. Absolute perfection cost time, and time was another resource winter stole. There is a faint, earthy smell rising from the chinking as the fire warms it. Clay softens slightly. Moss gives off a damp forest scent that reminds you this cabin was assembled from whatever the land offered nearby. Many trappers worked alone or with one partner, cutting logs by hand, fitting them together without nails whenever possible. Nails were heavy, expensive, and hard to replace. That is a well-established historical fact, repeated so often it becomes invisible. But here in the dim light you feel its weight again. Every design choice carries a reason. You notice the ceiling is low enough that you could touch it if you stood fully upright. Smoke stains darken the wood overhead, marking years of fires that burned just a little too enthusiastically. A low ceiling keeps heat close, but it also means smoke lingers. Trappers accepted sore eyes and scratchy throats as part of the trade. There are accounts of men sleeping half upright simply to keep their faces out of the thickest smoke. Historians still argue whether chronic smoke exposure shortened lives significantly, or whether cold and accidents played a larger role. Either way, the air here feels heavy used. You sit back down and let your gaze drift. The single window is more suggestion than opening now. Snow presses against it from the outside, glowing faintly blue in the firelight. Some trappers boarded windows shut entirely for winter, sacrificing daylight for warmth. Others left them partially open, believing a small connection to the outside helped with orientation and sanity. A few journals mention men waking in darkness and panic, unsure if it was midnight or morning. That confusion could be dangerous. You glance at the window again, grateful for the faint glow, even if it brings cold with it. The door is thick, built from planks fitted tightly together. You test it with your foot, feeling for give. There is some, always some. Wynne will find it later. You already know that. A quirky detail appears in several trapping memoirs where men stuffed spare socks or mittens into door gaps at night, pulling them free again in the morning. Clothing doubled as insulation. Fashion had no meaning here after sundown. You lean back against the wall and feel its solidity. The cabin does not feel strong because it is perfect. It feels strong because it has endured. Scratches mark the logs at shoulder height, reminders of knife-sharpening tool storage. Restless hands passing the time. Someone else slept here before you. Many someones. Their presence lingers in these small signs more than in any story they might have told. The fire pops softly. A spark jumps, then fades. You add a single piece of wood, careful not to overwhelm the hearth. A fire that burns too hot early will leave you cold later. This lesson appears repeatedly in winter survival accounts, almost always learned the hard way. You sit back and wait again, letting the cabin settle around you. It creaks once a deep sound from the roof, as snow shifts its weight. You breathe in, then out slowly. The space feels measured now. Understood at least a little. The cabin is not generous, but it is honest. It will give you what it can, no more. You accept that adjusting your position already, thinking ahead to where you will sleep, how you will arrange yourself to fit the shape of this place that was never meant to be kind, only sufficient. You move closer to the walls again, this time with a more critical eye. What looked solid at first glance now reveals its compromises. Between the logs, gaps appear where moss has shrunk or fallen away. Some are no wider than a finger. Others could admit a blade of wind without much argument. You feel along one seam and sense a faint thread of cold brushing your skin. It is not dramatic. That is what makes it dangerous. These cabins were rarely airtight. Trappers knew that complete sealing was almost impossible with the tools and time available. Instead, they aimed for a balance that kept most of the cold out, while allowing smoke to escape somewhere other than straight back into their lungs. That balance was imperfect and constantly shifting. A wall that behaved well in December might betray you in January when the wood contracted further. This is one of those mainstream realities that rarely makes it into romantic retellings. Winter shelters aged quickly, sometimes within a single season. You press a scrap of cloth into one of the gaps, pushing it deep with the handle of a knife. The action feels instinctive, even though you are learning it on the spot. Many trappers carried bits of fabric for this exact purpose, saved from worn shirts or torn blankets. It was not planned insulation. It was improvisation layered over improvisation. A quirky tidbit appears in a Hudson Bay Company letter, describing a man using dried grass mixed with animal grease to plug a wall seam when nothing else was available. It worked just long enough. The firelight exaggerates every crack. Shadows settle into the spaces between logs, making the walls look almost ribbed like the inside of something alive. You realize how much the cabin depends on stillness. When the wind pauses, the cold pauses too, giving you brief moments where the air feels almost gentle. When it returns, it tests each weakness methodically, as if memorizing the structure. You sit on the edge of your bedding and listen. A low whistle slides through the wall behind you, steady and patient. You adjust your position slightly, moving your back away from that spot. Trappers often arrange their sleeping places based on draft patterns rather than convenience. Over time, they learned where the cabin leaked most and avoided those areas after dark. Some journals describe men rotating bedding positions as winter deepened, following the cold as it found new paths. Historians still argue whether this level of sensitivity came from long experience or heightened awareness caused by isolation and fear. The floor contributes its own chill. Packed earth holds cold stubbornly even near the fire. You test it with your bare palm and pull back quickly. Sleeping directly on the ground was avoided whenever possible. Raised bunks, even crude ones, made a noticeable difference. Here the bedding is stacked on a low wooden frame, barely a foot off the floor, but enough to matter. That small elevation might decide how deeply the cold seeps into you overnight. You notice frost beginning to form along the lower logs, a faint white dusting that glitters when the fire flares. It is subtle, but unmistakable. Moisture from your breath, and the fire condenses and freezes where the wall is coldest. This interior frost was common enough that trappers mentioned it casually brushing it away in the morning as part of routine. To you, it feels unsettling. Ice inside a shelter suggests limits being reached. You add another small piece of wood, then stop. Too much heat too quickly can widen gaps as logs expand unevenly. That can create new drafts where none existed before. This detail appears in a handful of winter accounts, usually after the fact, when a man realizes his efforts to get warm made the cabin colder later on. The lesson settles in quietly. Moderation is survival. You lie back, briefly testing the bedding. Hides crackle softly beneath you. They are stiff with age but thick. The smell is strong, a mix of old animal and smoke, but it carries warmth with it. You shift again, placing your boots near the wall, soles facing inward so they will not freeze solid overnight. Frozen boots in the morning were a serious problem, sometimes requiring dangerous heating methods to soften them again. As the fire settles, the cabin sounds change. The whistle softens, the creaks deepen. Snow slides from the roof with a muffled thump that makes you tense, then relax. The structure holds. For now. You draw your coat tighter and sit still, letting your body learn the space the way your ears already have. The cabin is a collection of compromises, each one visible if you know how to look. Gaps, drafts, frost, sound. None of them alone are enough to defeat you. Together they demand attention. You stay alert without being anxious, aware that sleep here will come only if you respect the cold enough to notice it before it notices you. The night grows quieter in a way that feels deliberate, as if the world outside is holding its breath. Snow absorbs sound with remarkable efficiency. Wind loses its sharp edges. Distant movement vanishes entirely. You notice it most when you stop moving yourself. The cabin becomes a small island of noise in an otherwise muted landscape. You're breathing the soft settling of the fire, the faint crackle of cooling logs all seem louder than they should be. This silence was something trappers wrote about often, though rarely with drama. Winter journals describe nights where the absence of sound felt heavier than any storm. It was not comforting silence. It was the kind that demanded attention. When snow piles thick against trees and ground are like even familiar forests become acoustically strange. Animals move differently. Predators step more carefully. You sit still and listen, not expecting to hear much, but knowing that any sound at all will matter. You hear the roof shift again, a slow groan as snow redistributes its weight. This is normal. Cabins were built with steep roofs for a reason, encouraging snow to slide rather than accumulate. Even so heavy snowfall could overwhelm them. There are recorded instances of trappers waking to find their doors pinned shut by drifts or their roofs sagging dangerously low. Those stories rarely dwell on fear. They focus instead on the practical work of digging out and reinforcing before night returned. You lean back and let the quiet stretch. The firelight flickers less now, settling into a steady glow. Shadows hold their shape. Your eyes grow used to the dimness, picking out familiar outlines without effort. The bench, the hanging pelts, the dark rectangle of the window. Outside that window, snow presses close, dull and featureless, erasing depth and distance. A soft tapping sound reaches you, irregular and light. You freeze, listening. It comes again. Snow slipping from a branch. You release the tension slowly. Trappers learn to catalogue these sounds, separating harmless settling from genuine threat. One personal account mentions a man who slept poorly for weeks after mistaking falling snow for footsteps. Over time, he learned the difference, though. The learning itself cost him rest. There is still disagreement among modern researchers about how isolation affected auditory perception during long winters. Some suggest heightened sensitivity made people better listeners. Others believe fatigue and monotony distorted interpretation. Sitting here, you understand how either could be true. Your attention feels sharp, but also slightly untethered, floating on the edge of imagination. The silence deepens further. No wind now, no movement at all. The cold presses closer when the air stills sinking downward and pooling along the floor. You feel it creeping toward your boots. You shift them closer to the fire, careful not to crowd it. This subtle cold is different from the earlier drafts. It feels heavier, more settled, like something that has decided to stay. Snowfall continues outside, though you cannot hear it. This quiet accumulation was both blessing and threat. Snow-insulated cabins remarkably well. Once it packed tight against walls, sealing gaps more effectively than moss ever could. At the same time, it hid everything. Trails disappeared, landmarks vanished. Several trappers recorded stepping outside in the morning and momentarily losing their sense of direction even in familiar territory. You glance at the door again, reassured by its outline. It holds for now. The quiet makes time feel uncertain. Without sound or light cues, minutes stretch strangely. You find yourself counting breaths again, not out of fear, but to anchor yourself. Each exhale fogs faintly in the air, then dissolves. The cabin creaks once more, a low sound from the far corner then settles. Snow slides from the roof in a soft rush that barely registers. You imagine the world outside reshaping itself inch by inch, while you sit here warm enough to survive, not warm enough to forget where you are. This kind of quiet does not invite sleep immediately. It invites awareness. You stay still, listening to nothing and everything at once, learning the shape of the silence, the way you learn the shape of the walls. When sleep finally comes later, it will arrive gently slipping into these pauses, carried on the understanding that tonight the absence of sound is simply another thing to manage. You turn your attention back to the fire, because everything tonight eventually circles back to it. The cabin may shelter you. The walls may slow the cold, but the fire decides the rhythm of the night. You crouch and study it the way you might study a living thing. The flames allow more suggestion than spectacle, licking quietly at the wood. This is exactly what you want. Trappers rarely aimed for roaring fires after dark. Accounts from winter camps consistently note that a dramatic blaze felt reassuring but came with consequences. It burned fuel too quickly and pulled warm air straight up the chimney, leaving the rest of the cabin colder than before. Experienced men preferred a patient fire built to smoulder and release heat slowly. You adjust a log with care, nudging it just enough to improve contact without encouraging sudden flame. The smell changes as the fire settles. Fresh resin gives way to a deeper, sweeter scent as the wood warms through. Smoke thins and begins to rise more cleanly. Your eyes stop watering. This balance did not come naturally to most people. It was learned through uncomfortable nights and small mistakes. One lesser-known habit described in trapping letters involved deliberately using slightly damp wood in the evening, forcing the fire to burn slowly rather than flare. It sounds counterintuitive, but it worked often enough to be remembered. You sit back on your heels and feel the heat spread across your shins and hands. It is not intense, but it is steady. Steady matters. You glance toward the stack of firewood against the wall. It is smaller than you would like. Winter always makes resources look insufficient. Even men who entered the season well supplied wrote about a persistent unease when they counted remaining fuel. There is still no full agreement among historians about how much firewood trappers actually planned for versus how much they gathered reactively during winter. Either way, tonight's pile must last until morning. You place one more piece on the coals and stop yourself from adding another. It is tempting to build heat now while you're awake to manage it. But the goal is to let the fire fade slowly while you sleep, not to collapse into ash before midnight. Several recorded deaths involved men waking too cold to revive a fire easily. The memory of that danger lingers quietly in your mind, not as panic, but as discipline. The hearthstones radiate warmth even when the flames dip. You slide closer, then mark that distance with your eyes. Later, when you're lying down, you will want to place yourself where that warmth can still reach you without requiring movement. Everything is planned with minimal effort in mind. Cold punishes unnecessary motion. A faint crack sounds as a log shifts. You watch closely, ready to intervene if sparks leap. Fire inside a wooden cabin was always a calculated risk. Chimney fires stray embers, and collapsing hearths appear in frontier records often enough to be unsettling. Yet fire was non-negotiable. You manage risk because there is no alternative. The cabin responds to the growing warmth with soft noises. Logs expand slightly. The ceiling creaks once, then goes still. Drafts change direction, subtle enough that you feel them before you hear them. You make a small adjustment to a wall gap you noticed earlier, pressing the cloth deeper now that the wood has shifted. You breathe slowly, letting the fire do its work. Time stretches. Minutes pass without announcement. The glow from the hearth paints the cabin in amber and shadow. You notice how comforting that limited palette feels. Bright light would be unsettling here. Darkness softened by fire feels correct. Eventually you decide the fire is ready, not finished, just prepared. You bank the coals, carefully drawing ash over the brightest spots to slow their burn. This technique shows up in countless winter accounts, often described in passing as if everyone simply knew to do it. Watching the glow dim feels like closing your eyes halfway, not fully committing to sleep yet. You stand slowly, joints stiffening again as you leave the fire's immediate warmth. The cabin feels colder by contrast, reminding you how local that heat really is. You turn once more to check the hearth. It holds steady a quiet promise rather than a guarantee. Satisfied, you move toward the bedding, carrying the fire's warmth with you as best you can. The night will test whether your preparation was enough. For now, you have done what you can. The fire breathes softly behind you, and you let that sound guide you as you begin to settle in. As you move away from the hearth, you become aware of the air itself. It is not uniform. It shifts and curls warm near the fire, sharper near the walls, and unpredictable in between. You pause midway across the cabin and feel a thin ribbon of smoke brush your cheek. It is faint but noticeable. Smoke here is never simply gone. It lingers, tests you, reminds you that breathing is something you manage deliberately tonight. You crouch and look upward, following the smoke's path. It rises unevenly toward the chimney opening, hesitates, then slips away as if reconsidering. This hesitation was familiar to trappers. Chimneys in these cabins were often crude, sometimes nothing more than a wooden frame packed with clay. Changes in wind outside could reverse airflow unexpectedly. Several winter diaries mention nights spent half awake adjusting vents or doors to keep smoke moving the right direction. You ease the door open just a fraction, not enough to invite cold fully inside, but enough to change pressure. The effect is immediate. Smoke lifts more cleanly, drifting upward instead of curling back. Cold brushes your ankles, a sharp reminder of the trade you just made. You close the door again and slide the cloth at its base into a tighter seal. Managing smoke was a daily calculation. Too little ventilation and the air grew thick and bitter. Too much, and the cabin lost heat faster than the fire could replace it. Some trappers cut small adjustable vents high in the wall, plugging them with wood when storms howled. Others relied on gaps that could be opened or closed with rags and scraps. There was no standard solution. People adapted based on what materials they had and how the cabin behaved. A lesser-mentioned practice appears in a few personal letters where men burned certain woods only during the day, saving cleaner burning fuel for night. Pine, for example, flared brightly but smoked heavily. Hardwoods burned steadier and cleaner when available. These choices were not about comfort. They were about waking without a pounding head or burning lungs. You sit again and test the air with a slow breath. It smells of ash and resin, but it is breathable. Your chest loosens slightly. That is enough. Perfect air does not exist here. Acceptable air does. The walls respond again as temperatures shift. A faint pop echoes from the corner where two logs meet. You glance over alert, then relax when nothing follows. These sounds become part of the night's language. Over time, trappers learned which noises required action and which could be ignored. Several historical accounts describe men sleeping through storms that would terrify a newcomer simply because the cabin's usual complaints never changed pitch. There remains disagreement among historians about how often smoke-related illness affected long-term health in trapping communities. Some point to respiratory problems noted later in life. Others argue the greater threats were frostbite, malnutrition, and accidents. Sitting here, you understand why smoke was tolerated. It was unpleasant but predictable. Cold was relentless and unforgiving. You adjust your position once more, aligning yourself so that your head is slightly higher than your feet. This keeps smoke from settling around your face if airflow shifts again. It is a small detail, but one repeated quietly in winter survival advice, passed between men who expected not to see each other again. The fire murmurs softly behind you. Drafts feel calmer now, less intrusive. The cabin seems to have reached a temporary agreement with the night. You sense that this balance will not last forever. Wind will change, snow will settle, but for now the air holds steady. You rest your hands on your knees and breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale without urgency. The smell of smoke fades into the background, becoming part of the cabin rather than a threat. When sleep eventually arrives, it will do so under these conditions, negotiated inch by inch. Satisfied that the air will not betray you immediately, you turn your attention fully to rest. You move toward the bedding with care, knowing that once you lie down, every adjustment will feel heavier than it does now. The fire remains behind you, the smoke behaves, and the night, at least for this moment, allows you to settle. You finally turn toward the bedding, knowing this is where the night will truly be decided. What waits for you in the corner is not a bed in any modern sense. It is a layered arrangement of necessity. Hides, folded thick blankets, rough and heavy, all stacked with care rather than comfort in mind. You kneel beside it and press down with your palm. The surface resists, then slowly gives. That resistance matters. Too soft and the cold seeps up. Too hard and sleep never comes. Trappers rarely carried bedding designed only for sleeping. What you see here served multiple purposes during the day. Blankets doubled as door seals. Hides were worn, sat upon, wrapped around supplies. By night they were gathered again into this single pile. Period descriptions repeatedly show men sleeping in what they owned, not what they preferred. The idea of a dedicated mattress belonged to towns, not traplines. You lift one hide and feel its weight. It is stiff with age edges curling slightly. The smell is strong but familiar, a mix of animal smoke and thyme. This scent clings to you as you arrange the layers, placing the thickest pieces closest to the ground. Cold rises slowly from below, patient and persistent. Elevation helps, but thickness matters more. Men who underestimated this often woke with numb limbs and shallow breath. A small detail appears in several personal accounts where trappers added spruce boughs beneath their bedding when available. The needles created air pockets that improved insulation and released a faint forest scent as they warmed. It was not luxurious, but it helped. You look around the cabin. No boughs here. This bedding will have to suffice on its own. You sit down carefully, then shift your weight inch by inch. The hides crackle softly beneath you, settling into a shape that matches your body. You pull a blanket around your shoulders and pause, listening to how the fabric moves. Sound travels strangely here. Even small adjustments feel amplified. You remind yourself to move slowly, deliberately conserving warmth. There is no agreement among historians about how well trappers actually slept during winters like this. Some journals suggest nights of deep exhaustion fueled rest. Others hint at long hours of half-sleep waking repeatedly to tend fire or adjust layers. Lying here, you suspect the truth sits somewhere in between. Sleep will come in fragments shaped by cold and vigilance. You arrange your boots, next sliding them under the edge of the bedding so they benefit from trapped warmth. Frozen boots in the morning could mean delays injuries or worse. This practice appears quietly in many winter routines rarely explained because it was assumed knowledge. You place your gloves inside your coat near your chest. They will be stiff otherwise. The cabin feels different from this low position. Drafts brush your face that you didn't notice while standing. You turn slightly, angling your back toward the warmest wall. This is where experience shows itself. Men learned over time how to align their bodies with the cabin's best angles, avoiding cold seams without conscious thought. The fire glows steadily now, its light dimmer but dependable. You watch it for a moment longer, memorizing its shape so you will know if it changes later. The air smells warmer here, heavier, carrying smoke and wool and hide together. It is not pleasant, but it is survivable. You pull the final blanket up to your chin and pause again. Your breathing slows, each inhale measured, each exhale visible for a moment before fading. The bedding holds your heat imperfectly, but enough. You feel the cold press from outside, testing, waiting. Sleep does not arrive immediately. Instead, you rest in a quiet middle place, aware of the cabin, the fire, your own body adjusting. This is how nights begin here, not with surrender, but with careful acceptance. You do not remove your clothing before settling in. That idea belongs to warmer places and kinder nights. Here what you wear is part of the bedding itself. Wool stays on. Layers remain buttoned and tied. Only the stiffest outer pieces come off, and even those stay close. You loosen nothing that might let heat escape without purpose. The shirt against your skin is scratchy, but it holds warmth even when damp. Wool does that. People of the time understood this through use rather than explanation. Long before anyone measured fibres or wrote manuals, trappers trusted wool because it worked when cotton failed. Linen grew cold and unforgiving. Wool stayed patient. Period clothing inventories show how dominant it was in winter gear, not because it was elegant, but because it forgave mistakes. You tug your coat tighter and feel how it traps air between layers. Air is the real insulator. Fabric simply holds it still. You settle your shoulders, then stop moving again. Too much adjustment now wastes what you've just built. Men learn to arrange themselves carefully, knowing every shift would require rebuilding warmth from scratch. Your boots remain close soles angled toward your legs. Leather stiffens in extreme cold. There are mentions in winter journals of boots left too far from the body, freezing into shapes that could not be worn until thawed, or heated dangerously near flame. You're not interested in testing that lesson yourself. You tuck them closer and feel reassured by their presence. Your hat stays on. Even as you lie back, you pull it lower over your ears. Heat escapes quickly from the head, and nights like this punish neglect. A small observation appears in several trapping accounts, where men slept with scarves tied loosely over their mouths, warming each breath before it reached the lungs. You consider it, then decide against it. The air feels manageable for now. There remains uncertainty among researchers about how much sleep clothing contributed to overall survival versus simple endurance. Some argue the layers made little difference once the fire faded. Others believe the cumulative effect mattered greatly over weeks and months. Lying here, you know it matters tonight. You can feel the difference in how quickly your body steadies. You place your hands against your stomach, one over the other. This posture feels natural, protective. It keeps fingers warm and still. Fingers lose heat faster than almost any other part of the body. Trappers often complained about numb hands long before their core temperature dropped. You flex them once, then stop. The cabin sounds feel closer now. From this low angle, the walls seem taller, the ceiling nearer. The fire murmurs softly. A faint hiss rises from a log as moisture escapes. You listen without opening your eyes. This sound means warmth is still being released. That knowledge soothes more than the heat itself. Your breath falls into a steady rhythm. In through the nose, out through the mouth, just enough to avoid chilling the airways. This habit was taught quietly, often learned young. Cold air drawn directly into the lungs feels sharp and wrong. You adjust automatically, not thinking about it anymore. A memory surfaces of a note written by a trapper who mentioned sleeping fully dressed knife still on his belt because undressing felt like tempting fate. That detail appears briefly, almost as an aside, but it says everything about trust. You do the same, keeping essential tools within reach, not because you expect trouble, but because readiness calms the mind. You feel the bedding compress beneath you, slowly moulding to your shape. The hides warm where they touch you. The space beneath the blankets grows quieter, darker. This pocket of warmth is small, but it is yours. You guard it by staying still. Outside, the night continues its work unseen. Snow presses closer to the walls. The world shrinks. Inside, your focus narrows further. The firelight dims another shade. You open your eyes once to check it, then close them again, satisfied. Sleep approaches cautiously. It does not rush. It circles, testing whether you will stay warm enough to accept it. You let your thoughts slow, releasing the day without effort. There is no need to force rest here. Fatigue will do the work for you. Your body sinks a little deeper into the bedding. Heat stabilizes. The cold does not retreat, but it pauses. That pause is enough. Wrapped in wool, surrounded by the quiet labor of fire and wood, you drift toward the edge of sleep, fully clothed, fully aware, and just warm enough to remain. As sleep edges closer, you become aware of something subtler than fire or fabric. Heat is gathering in pockets around you, held in place by stillness. It is not warmth in the comforting sense. It is more like resistance against loss. The blankets, your clothing, even the shape of your body work together to slow the escape of energy. You feel it most along your sides, where air has fewer paths to slip away. People living this way understood heat as something to be captured rather than created endlessly. Surviving notes from winter camps show a clear awareness that the body itself was part of the system. Movement generated warmth, but too much movement wasted it. Stillness allowed heat to pool. This understanding rarely appeared as instruction. It was learned by listening to one's own limits night after night. You draw your knees slightly upward, curling just enough to reduce exposed surface. This posture comes naturally in the cold. It shortens the body tuck's vulnerable areas inward and creates shared warmth between limbs. Trappers were often depicted in sketches and descriptions, sleeping in these compact positions not out of discomfort but efficiency. Space under blankets mattered. Every inch counted. A small but revealing habit shows up in a few winter recollections where men placed a warm stone from the hearth near their feet before sleeping. It did not stay warm long, but it offered a brief boost that helped them relax into rest. You consider the idea, then decide against it. The fire is steady enough and you prefer not to disturb it now. The thought alone is oddly reassuring. You notice your breath warming the air beneath the blankets. Each exhale lingers, raising the temperature by a fraction before dissipating. This trapped breath creates a microclimate, faint but meaningful. Over time, your body adapts to its slowing its demands. You feel your shoulders drop, tension easing. There has never been complete agreement among historians about how much body heat alone contributed to surviving nights like this versus external sources like fire. Some argue the fire did most of the work. Others point out that once the fire faded, the body's ability to conserve heat determined outcomes. Lying here, you understand the argument is not simple. It is cooperation, not competition. The cabin responds to your stillness. Sounds soften further. The earlier creaks fade. Snow presses gently against the wall, sealing tiny gaps with its weight. This unintended insulation was often welcomed. Winter shelters sometimes became warmer as storms continued, not colder as long as structures held. That detail surprises many people, but it appears quietly in seasonal records. You shift your hands once more, placing them where warmth feels strongest. Then you stop. Your body settles into a steady state, neither heating nor cooling rapidly. This balance feels fragile but real. You protect it by letting your thoughts slow. The firelight flickers faintly through your closed eyelids. It pulses like a heartbeat in the room. You no longer feel compelled to watch it. Trust builds slowly here, but it builds. Outside, the night remains vast and indifferent. Inside, a small system of wood fabric breath and patience holds together. You float on the edge of sleep, aware of your own warmth as something earned, something maintained. Heat is no longer just sensation. It is strategy. With that understanding settled deep in your body, you allow sleep to take a firmer hold. Not all the way, just enough to rest while remaining ready. In a place like this, that balance is the closest thing to comfort you can expect. Hunger makes itself known in a quiet, persistent way as the night deepens. It is not a sharp pain. It is more like a hollow awareness that warmth depends on fuel you no longer have easy access to. You ate earlier, deliberately choosing foods meant to last rather than satisfy. Now your body works through that choice, slowly turning fat and grain into steady heat. Trappers understood this connection without naming it. Winter camp descriptions repeatedly mention heavy evening meals, not because men were indulgent, but because they learned what carried them through the night. Meat cooked down in fat-dense breads, anything that released energy gradually. Light meals disappeared too quickly. You feel digestion happening now, a subtle warmth, spreading from deep inside, different from the fire's heat. It feels slower, more reliable. You shift slightly and then stop yourself. Even this small movement costs energy. You let your body continue its quiet work undisturbed. The smell of earlier cooking still lingers faintly in the cabin, mingling with smoke and wool. It is not an inviting smell, but it signals preparation intention. Someone planned to last the night here. A small detail appears in a handful of winter journals where men described keeping a piece of hard bread or dried meat within reach of their bedding, eating a few bites if they woke cold in the early hours. It was not comfort eating, it was maintenance. You glance toward your pack, considering it, then decide against disturbing the warmth you have built. The fire still holds. Your stomach feels steady enough. There has never been a single agreed explanation for how much nighttime eating improves survival versus simple endurance. Some later interpretations suggest the psychological comfort mattered as much as calories. Others argue the metabolic effect was decisive. Lying here, you sense both are true. Knowing food is available calms the mind. Consuming it feeds the fire inside. Your breathing deepens as digestion continues. The blankets feel heavier now, not because they changed, but because your body relaxes into them. Heat distribution evens out. Cold no longer presses as sharply at the edges of your awareness. This is the payoff for restraint earlier. You did not overfeed the fire. You did not waste motion. You allowed warmth to arrive gradually. The cabin remains quiet. Snow still presses at the walls. Somewhere wood settles with a soft click. You listen without opening your eyes. Everything sounds stable. That stability encourages rest more than any blanket could. You curl your hands again near your stomach, instinctively protecting the source of that internal heat. Fingers warm slightly. Toes follow more slowly. These changes are small but noticeable if you pay attention. Trappers often described becoming acutely aware of their own bodies during winter, noticing changes that would go ignored in warmer seasons. Cold sharpens perception. You feel a faint wave of drowsiness pass through you, heavier than before. This is different from simple exhaustion. It is the body signaling that its immediate needs are met. Sleep, even light sleep, becomes possible now. Outside, the night remains unchanged. Inside, something has shifted. Heat is no longer only borrowed from the fire. It is being generated, sustained. You rest in that understanding, letting your thoughts loosen their grip. Sleep settles closer, no longer circling at a distance. You accept it without ceremony, knowing you will surface again if the cold demands attention. For now, fed and wrapped and still, you allow rest to take hold, trusting the quiet work happening beneath the blankets to carry you through the next stretch of darkness. Memory has a strange way of surfacing in the dark. As you lie there, fed and warming from within earlier meals return to you more clearly than their flavours ever did at the time. You remember them by effect rather than taste. How long the warmth lasted, how deeply it settled. Food here was never about pleasure. It was measured by how well it carried you from evening into morning. Winter records from trapping routes often list provisions with almost clinical focus. Fat flour, dried meat. These items appear again and again because they performed reliably in cold conditions. They burned slowly in the body, releasing energy over hours rather than minutes. Fresh foods were rare luxuries enjoyed quickly when available, but they could not be counted on. You feel that logic now as your stomach works steadily, neither empty nor full, just occupied. A brief note in one trapper's notebook mentions dreaming vividly after nights when meals were heavier, as if the body relieved of immediate strain allowed the mind to wander further. It is an observation easy to overlook, written without explanation, but it lingers with you. Even now your thoughts feel softer, less urgent, as if the edges have been smoothed. Not everyone agrees on how consistent these eating patterns were across regions and individuals. Some interpretations suggest wide variation depending on supply lines and luck. Others believe most trappers converged on similar habits simply because alternatives failed. Lying here you sense how repetition would shape routine. When something works, it becomes tradition quickly. The smell of stored food remains faintly in the cabin. Dried meat carries a sharpness that mixes with smoke and hide. Flour dust clings to the bottom of your pack. These scents are quiet reminders of planning and restraint. Nothing here is abundant, but enough has been arranged. Your body continues its quiet work. Warmth radiates outward from your core, slow and dependable. The fire's glow has dimmed further, but you are less aware of it now. Your reliance has shifted inward. This transition matters. Many winter nights were survived not because the fire lasted, but because the body did. You notice how still you've become. Muscles slacken. Your jaw unclenches. Breathing deepens without effort. This stillness protects heat better than any movement could. Trappers often learn to wake only when necessary, training themselves to remain motionless through discomfort, rather than burn energy adjusting endlessly. It was a discipline learned through long nights exactly like this one. A faint creak travels through the cabin, then fades. You do not react. It sounds familiar now. The building has its own rhythms, and you have begun to recognize them. Snow continues to insulate the walls, pressing gently, sealing small gaps. The outside world feels distant, reduced to pressure rather than presence. Your thoughts drift again slower this time. Memories blur with imagined scenes. Camps you've never seen feel oddly familiar. This blending of real and remembered experience appears often in winter journals, though rarely explained. Some men wrote of nights where time felt stretched as if the mind slipped free of strict sequence. Whether this came from fatigue, isolation, or the monotony of cold remains an open question. Sleep deepens not suddenly, but layer by layer. You remain dimly aware of the cabin, the fire, your own breath. But these awarenesses soften. They no longer demand response. For now, nothing requires action. Wrapped in warmth earned through planning and patience, you sink further into rest. Food continues its quiet work. Heat holds. The night moves on without you needing to follow it. In this small pocket of survival, you let sleep claim more of your attention, trusting that memory and instinct will bring you back if the cold asks again. Something wakes you, though it takes a moment to understand what. It is not a sound, exactly more a change in pressure, a subtle shift in how the cabin holds itself. You remain still, eyes closed, listening. The cold feels closer than it did before, not biting, just present. You breathe once, slowly testing the air. It feels a little sharper. That tells you enough. You open your eyes and look toward the hearth. The fire's reduced itself to a low constellation of embers glowing faintly beneath a blanket of ash. This is expected. Nights like this are measured in how well you prepare for moments exactly like this one. You do not rush. Rushing wastes heat and clarity. It's heat. As you lie there, you notice another sound. A long, drawn-out creak from the roof, followed by a soft, settling thump. Snow is shifting again. Heavy snowfall has a way of rearranging itself throughout the night, sliding, compacting, testing structures repeatedly. Trappers became familiar with these movements. They learned which sounds meant harmless settling, and which hinted at strain. You sit up slowly, pulling the blankets with you so your core remains covered. The cold reaches for your back, immediately reminding you why speed matters less than efficiency. You swing your legs toward the edge of the bedding and pause, letting your body adjust before standing. Dizziness in the cold is not uncommon, especially when rising from deep rest. The floor feels unforgiving beneath your boots, even through leather. You flex your toes once relieved, they still respond easily. This simple check appears quietly in many winter routines, rarely described in detail, but clearly practiced. Sensation matters. You move toward the hearth, each step deliberate. Kneeling beside the fire, you brush ash aside gently. The embers brighten in response like eyes opening in the dark. This is a good sign. It means your earlier choices paid off. You add a single thin piece of wood, listening as it begins to catch. No flame yet, just a soft hiss as warmth returns. A small observation in one winter journal describes the satisfaction of seeing embers revive after hours of sleep, compared to the dread of finding them dead. That line is written plainly, but it carries weight. You feel that same quiet relief now. The night has not beaten you yet. You glance up at the walls as the fire strengthens. Frost has crept higher since you last looked, tracing pale lines along the lower logs. This interior frost was a common sight, in extreme cold, noted often but rarely expanded upon. It looks fragile, almost decorative, but it signals how thin the margin remains. There is still discussion among historians about how often trappers woke during the night to tend fires. Some accounts suggest once or twice was typical. Others imply far more frequent interruptions during severe weather. Standing here half awake, you understand how variable it must have been. Tonight, one waking feels sufficient. The fire responds quickly to your care. Flames rise modestly, then settle back into a steady glow. Heat begins to radiate outward again, slow but dependable. You warm your hands briefly, then stop. Lingering here too long would undo the balance you work to create. You turn back toward the bedding, taking care not to stir the air more than necessary. The cabin feels different now, awake in a quiet way. Sounds sharpen slightly. The fire crackles, the roof rests. Snow continues its work outside, unseen but felt. You slide back under the blankets and settle into the warmth you preserved. The cold retreats just enough to be manageable. Your body relaxes again, reassured by the fire's renewed presence. Sleep returns more quickly this time. You drift back into it knowing you responded when needed, no sooner, no later. That timing matters. In places like this, survival often came down to listening closely enough to act before discomfort became danger. Wrapped once more in layered warmth, you let your eyes close. The fire watches over the cabin again. The night continues, but you no longer feel quite so exposed within it. You lie still again, aware that the fire has returned to its quiet work, and with it, a subtle change in how the cabin feels. Wind has found its way back, though, not loudly. It presses along the walls in slow, searching passes, as if testing for new weaknesses. You feel it more than hear a faint cooling along one shoulder, a whisper near your feet. This is where the cabin's flaws make themselves known. Not all at once, not dramatically. The cold arrives through specific places chosen by pressure and chance. Men who spent winters in shelters like this learn to map these patterns without thinking. Certain corners always felt colder. Certain seams never quite behaved. Over time, bodies remembered what minds no longer needed to track. You turn, slightly adjusting your position so your back rests against the warmer wall. This movement is slow and deliberate blankets pulled close, so heat does not escape unnecessarily. Even small adjustments matter now. You settle again and wait for warmth to rebuild where it was disturbed. It does gradually as long as you stay still. Outside, the wind gathers strength, then eases. Snow shifts again on the roof, not sliding this time but compressing. The weight increases the pressure against the logs, tightening gaps in some places while opening others. This constant reshaping of shelter was something winter residents accepted as normal. Cabins were not static objects. They responded to weather minute by minute. A brief mention in an old camp ledger describes men packing snow deliberately against cabin walls once storms passed, shaping drift into windbreaks. It seems counterintuitive, inviting cold closer, yet it worked by sealing drafts and slowing air movement. You imagine the exterior of this cabin buried deep, now insulated by the very thing that threatens it. The wind slips under the door, thin but persistent. You feel it brush your ankles. Without sitting up fully, you reach down and tug the spare blanket edge tighter along the floor. This small action brings immediate relief. The cold recedes just enough to notice. Such habits appear quietly in winter routines rarely explained because they were assumed knowledge among those who needed them. There is still uncertainty about how much wind exposure versus raw temperature determined survival in these environments. Some later assessments focus on extreme cold alone. Others emphasize how moving air stripped heat far faster than still conditions ever could. Lying here, you know the difference instinctively. Cold you can endure. Wind demands response. The cabin sounds change as the gusts pass. A low moan moves along the roofline, then fades. Logs rub against one another with a dry wooden sigh. You listen without tension. These sounds have become familiar, now part of the night's background rather than threats. Your breath remains steady. The air feels slightly drier, sharper, but manageable. You tuck your chin closer to your chest, reducing exposed skin. The blanket rises and falls gently with each breath, creating a small pocket of warmer air that stays close. You think briefly of the men who slept through storms far worse than this sometimes for weeks on end. Their accounts rarely dwell on bravery. They focus instead on small decisions made correctly again and again. Where to sleep, how to angle the body, when to move, when to remain still. The wind outside strengthens once more, then settles into a steady flow. The cabin holds. Snow absorbs some of the force, muffling what would otherwise be sharp and restless. Inside, your warmth stabilizes again. Sleep does not deepen much further for now. Instead, you hover in a light, watchful rest, aware but not anxious. This kind of sleep was common in winter camps, according to several personal writings. It allowed quick response without fully waking the body. Whether it was learned deliberately or emerged naturally remains unclear. For you, it simply feels appropriate. You rest without surrendering awareness entirely. The wind continues its slow work. The fire breathes softly. The cabin stands between you and the cold, imperfect but sufficient. Wrapped in layers of wood fabric and practiced stillness, you remain at ease within the night's movement, letting sleep hold you lightly, while the storm tests the world beyond the walls. Time loosens its grip sometime after that. You sense it slipping without being able to mark when it happens. The darkness inside the cabin no longer feels tied to hours. It becomes a steady state. You drift in and out of shallow sleep, waking just enough to notice the fire's glow or the pressure of blankets, then sinking again. This pattern of rest appears often in winter camp descriptions, though it is rarely framed as a problem. Men wrote about sleeping in segments, waking briefly to check fire or listen, then returning to rest. Continuous unbroken sleep was not expected. Survival shaped expectations differently. Rest was measured by whether you could function the next day, not by how deeply you dreamed. You wake again without opening your eyes, aware that the cabin sounds have shifted. The fire crackles a little more actively now, having settled into a new balance. Wind has eased, replaced by a dense stillness. Cold feels heavier in still air, more present, but also more predictable. You breathe slowly, adjusting without moving. You consider rising to check the fire, then decide against it. This judgment matters. Too much vigilance wastes strength. Several winter accounts mention learning when not to act, trusting earlier preparations. Those who rose too often burned energy they could not easily replace. Those who waited too long sometimes paid dearly. Knowing the difference was learned gradually. A small, easily missed detail appears in one trapping narrative, where a man described using his sense of smell to judge the fire without opening his eyes. If smoke thickened or changed character, he knew it was time to intervene. You test the air now. It smells steady. Warm wood. Ash. No sharpness. You remain where you are. Your body has settled into a stable rhythm. Heat loss slows. Fingers remain warm enough. Toes still respond when you flex them slightly beneath the blankets. These checks happen almost unconsciously now. Awareness has become habit. There is disagreement among modern readers about whether such fragmented sleep was harmful or simply different. Some view it as deprivation. Others argue it matched natural rhythms shaped by environment rather than clocks. Lying here, you do not feel deprived. You feel adapted. The cabin holds its shape around you. Frost remains etched along the lower logs unchanged. Snow presses firmly from outside ceiling gaps that would otherwise leak cold air. The structure feels quieter now, less responsive to minor shifts. This stability invites deeper rest. You drift again, thoughts dissolving before they form fully. Images surface briefly, then fade. The fire's glow pulses softly through your eyelids. The weight of the blankets feels reassuring, anchoring you in place. When you wake once more, it is without urgency. You sense rather than see that hours have passed. The night has thinned slightly, though dawn is still distant. You remain still, conserving warmth, letting the cabin and your body continue their shared work. Rest here is not an escape from the night. It is a partnership with it. You sleep when you can, wake when you must, and trust that this rhythm, imperfect as it is, will carry you through. With that trust settled, you let your awareness soften again, allowing another shallow layer of sleep to settle over you, knowing you will surface when needed, and not before. You wake this time with a clearer sense of purpose, not fear, not urgency, just readiness. Your eyes open slowly, adjusting to the dim glow that still lingers near the hearth. The fire's not died, but it has thinned, reduced to a quiet persistence. That is enough for now. Your hand moves instinctively, checking the space beside you. The rifle rests where you left it angled, so you can reach it without sitting up fully. The knife is still on your belt, its weight familiar against your side. These tools are not about expectation. They are about reassurance. Men who lived this way slept better, knowing their essentials were within reach. That habit shows up repeatedly in winter camp notes, often mentioned only in passing, as if it required no explanation. You remain still for a moment longer, listening. The cabin feels calm. No scraping at the walls, no sudden movement outside. Snow has done its quiet work, burying sound again. You breathe slowly, letting your body wake without rushing. Sudden movement invites cold in places you cannot easily warm again. You sit up just enough to test your joints, stiff but responsive. That matters. Cold nights sometimes stole movement without warning. You rotate your shoulders once, then stop. Enough. You do not want to undo the warmth you've preserved. Tools stayed close at night for reasons beyond defence. A flint striker, a tinder, a knife to split kindling. These items could mean the difference between reviving a fire easily or struggling while heat drained away. One winter letter describes a man waking to find his flint frozen to the floor where he had set it down earlier. After that, he slept with it inside his coat. Small lessons carried forward quietly. There has never been full agreement about how often trappers faced real danger during the night versus perceived threat. Some records emphasize animal encounters. Others suggest most nights passed without incident. What is consistent is preparedness. Readiness calmed the mind, whether danger arrived or not. You adjust the blankets and slide your feet closer to the warmth. Boots are still flexible. Good. You slip your hands inside them, briefly sharing heat both ways. Leather benefits from it. So do fingers. The fire murmurs again as a log shifts. You watch it without standing. No sparks leap, no smoke thickens, the balance holds. You allow yourself to relax a little further. Outside, the night remains vast and indifferent. Inside, your small circle of control feels intact. Tools, fire, body, shelter, each piece still doing its job. You settle back into the bedding, not to sleep deeply now, but to rest while alertness softens. Morning will come when it comes. For now, this moment is enough. You close your eyes again, comforted by the quiet weight of readiness around you, knowing that if the night asks something more of you, you are prepared to answer. You sense movement outside before you hear it. Not footsteps exactly. More a presence shifting through the snow, deliberate and cautious. Your eyes open without urgency. You remain still listening, letting the sound define itself, before your mind assigns meaning to it. A faint crunch reaches you, then another spaced apart. Something is circling the cabin, testing its edges the way wind does. You breathe slowly, keeping the blankets close, feeling your body stay warm despite the alertness rising quietly inside you. This is not fear, it is tension. Animals move differently in winter. Hunger sharpened their caution as much as their boldness. Trappers wrote often about hearing life outside their cabins at night, usually without embellishment. Wolves, foxes, sometimes larger shapes that never revealed themselves fully. These encounters were not always dangerous, but they were never ignored. You tilt your head slightly, tracking the sound as it shifts from one side of the cabin to the other. Snow muffles everything, turning motion into suggestion. You do not reach for the rifle yet. You listen instead. A predator curious enough to circle but unwilling to approach closer is gathering information just as you are. One rarely noticed detail in winter journals describes men scattering ash or scraps outside their doors before sleeping, creating a faint barrier of scent and texture that animals disliked crossing. It was not foolproof, but it added hesitation. You do not know if that was done here. The thought passes, then settles. The sound pauses near the door. You hold your breath for a moment, then let it out slowly through your nose. Panic tightens muscles and wastes warmth. You will not offer that advantage. Your hand rests near your knife now, not gripping it, just acknowledging it is there. There is still no single explanation agreed upon regarding how often trappers face serious animal threats at night, versus imagined ones amplified by isolation. Some records describe close encounters. Others suggest long winters heightened perception until every sound felt charged. Sitting here, you know the distinction matters less than readiness. The movement resumes slower now, then fades outward into the snow. Whatever was there has decided the cabin is not worth the effort. You wait longer than feels necessary before relaxing again. Trust returns gradually. Fire continues its quiet work. The cabin holds. Your body remains warm enough. You let your hand fall back against the blankets, fingers uncurling, muscles loosen. Outside, the night closes in again, smooth and indifferent. Inside, the small system you rely on has proven itself once more. Shelter did not need to be aggressive. It only needed to be uninviting. You draw the blankets closer and settle back into stillness. Sleep does not return immediately, but rest does. The difference matters. You remain aware without tension, breathing evenly, letting the warmth rebuild where alertness disturbed it. Eventually, the last trace of movement outside dissolves completely. Snow absorbs everything again. You remain alone with the fire, the wood, and your own breath, reassured not by silence, but by its return. You allow your eyes to close, knowing the night has tested you briefly and moved on. Wrapped in patience and practiced restraint, you drift once more towards sleep, confident that for now, the cabin has done its job. Your breathing becomes something you notice again, not because it is laboured, but because it leaves a mark. Each exhale blooms faintly in the air before fading a small cloud that rises and disappears. In the deeper cold of the night, breath does not vanish immediately. It lingers, then settles, and in doing so it changes the space around you. Moisture gathers quietly in cabins like this. It clings to walls, settles into fabric freezes where warmth cannot reach. Trappers learn to recognize the signs early. A thin white film appears along the lower logs. The edges of blankets stiffen slightly. Even beards could collect frost overnight. Winter camp notes mention this often, not as complaint, but as observation. Moisture was expected. Managing it was part of staying alive. You shift just enough to feel the frost beneath your fingertips on the wall beside you. It is dry and powdery, easily brushed away, but you do not bother. That frost marks where warmth has lost ground. It will return whether you clear it or not. What matters is that it stays away from your body. A curious habit appears in a few accounts where men shook out blankets briefly near the fire in the early morning, knocking loose ice crystals formed from breath during the night. It sounds trivial, but over weeks, moisture trapped in bedding could sap warmth and comfort. You make a mental note without urgency. That task belongs to morning. Your breath slows again as you settle. You draw air in through your nose, warming it before it reaches your lungs. Mouth breathing in this cold feels wrong, sharp, and draining. This technique was learned early by anyone who spent winters outdoors, passed along quietly without instruction manuals or explanation. Bodies learned faster than words. There is ongoing uncertainty about how much interior frost contributed to long-term health problems among trappers. Some later readings suggest dampness worsened illness. Others point out that cold itself was the greater danger. Lying here, you know the frost is not ideal, but it is manageable. It is another condition to work around, not an immediate threat. The fire's warmth ebbs and flows gently, never quite disappearing. It keeps the worst of the moisture at bay near the hearth, while the far corners of the cabin grow colder and whiter. This unevenness defines the space. You sleep where warmth holds longest. The rest of the cabin can freeze if it must. You pull the blanket slightly higher, trapping more of your breath beneath it. The air there grows warmer, softer. You feel the difference along your cheeks. This small pocket becomes its own environment, one you protect by staying still. Outside, the night remains unchanged. Snow continues to press and settle. Inside, your breath and the fire work together in quiet cooperation. One without the other would not be enough. Together they hold the line. You drift again, thoughts slowing to the pace of your breathing. Frost forms, heat holds. The cabin exists in layers now, some frozen, some alive with warmth. You rest within the narrow band where survival is comfortable enough to allow sleep. With your breath steady and your body settled, you let awareness fade further, trusting that you will wake again if conditions shift. For now, the balance holds, and that is enough to carry you deeper into the night. Fear arrives quietly here if it arrives at all. It does not rush in with images or racing thoughts. It settles as a subtle tension, a tightening you notice only when you check yourself. You become aware of it during pauses, when the fire dips, when the cabin goes too still, when your body wakes just enough to remember where you are. You recognize this feeling without naming it. Panic would be louder, panic would waste warmth. What you feel instead is something learned, attention held lightly like a tool kept sharp but unused. Men who spent winters like this understood that fear itself was not the enemy. Uncontrolled fear was. You breathe slowly and deliberately, lengthening each exhale. This has an immediate effect. Muscles soften. Your shoulders sink deeper into the bedding. Heat redistributes instead of fleeing outward. Winter survival writings often emphasize physical skills, but emotional control appears just as often usually implied rather than explained. Calm was practiced, not assumed. You remind yourself of small certainties. The fire still glows, the cabin still stands, your body remains warm enough. These thoughts are not reassurances in the modern sense. They're inventory. Listing what is stable helps keep the mind anchored. This habit surfaces repeatedly in personal accounts, though rarely described as strategy. It was simply how people stayed steady. An easily overlooked detail in one winter letter described a man counting the sounds he could hear when anxiety crept in. Fire, wind, roof, breath. If the list stayed the same, he allowed himself to rest. You do the same now. Fire murmurs, wind is absent, roof holds, breath is slow, nothing new demands response. There is no clear agreement among later commentators about how isolation shaped the inner lives of trappers during long winters. Some suggest it hardened them, others believe it made them more inward, more reflective. Lying here you sense both. Awareness sharpens, thoughts simplify. You notice how the cabin itself seems calmer when you're calm. Drafts feel less intrusive. Sounds lose their edge. This may be perception rather than reality, but the effect is useful regardless. Managing fear manages energy. Your body responds quickly to the shift. Fingers warm slightly. Toes follow. The blankets feel heavier again, anchoring you in place. You stop scanning the dark and let your eyes remain closed. Outside, the night remains unchanged. It does not respond to your fear or your calm. Inside, however, your experience changes markedly. This difference matters. Survival here is not about dominating the environment. It is about working within yourself. You let the last trace of tension drain away. Thoughts slow to simple impressions. Warmth, stillness, breath. The fire's glow behind your eyelids pulses gently, no longer demanding attention. Sleep deepens again, not abruptly, but with a sense of permission. You have assessed. You have adjusted. Nothing more is required right now. Wrapped in practiced calm, you drift back into rest, knowing that fear may return later, and that when it does, you will meet it the same way, quietly, deliberately, without wasting what little warmth the night allows you to keep. Stories begin to surface when the night stretches long enough. Not spoken aloud, not shared with anyone else, but replayed quietly in your own mind. In cabins like this, men fill the darkness with remembered voices, familiar scenes, fragments of conversation carried far from where they began. Silence invited memory. Memory helped time move. Winter camp writings often hint at this without lingering on it. Mentions of songs hummed softly, of prayers repeated without urgency, of conversations recalled word for word. These habits were not about entertainment. They were a way to keep the mind oriented, to prevent it from drifting too far inward, where fear or despair might take hold. Thought needed direction, just like fire and breath. You remember places you have been that feel warmer than this, not in temperature but in texture. The sound of boards underfoot, the smell of cooked food shared with others. These memories arrive without effort, then fade, replaced by the steady presence of the cabin again. You let them pass. Holding on to them too tightly can sharpen loneliness. Letting them drift keeps balance. One brief note tucked into a winter journal mentions a trapper who told himself the same story every night before sleeping, always stopping at the same place. He wrote that it helped him measure time. If he remembered reaching the ending, he knew the night had been easier than expected. It is a small detail but revealing. Routine extended even into thought. There is no settled view on how much storytelling, even silent storytelling, affected mental health during long winters. Some later readings suggest it preserved clarity. Others argue it deepened isolation by pulling the mind away from the present. Lying here, you sense the benefit lies in moderation. Enough to occupy the mind, not enough to replace reality. Your breathing remains slow, and even as these thoughts come and go, the fire holds steady. The cabin stays quiet. Snow presses in from outside, shaping the world smaller, simpler. Inside, your attention narrows to what matters. You notice how memory softens the edges of the night. Time feels less heavy. Hours pass without being counted. This effect appears again and again in personal writings, though rarely explained. Men simply noted that some nights felt shorter than others, without tying the feeling to any single cause. You allow another memory to surface, then let it fade. No effort is required. The night accepts this rhythm: thought, stillness, breath, warmth. Each takes its turn without demanding control. Sleep drifts closer again, carried on these gentle mental currents. You do not force it. You let it arrive when it is ready. The cabin does not change. The fire does not flare. Nothing interrupts. Wrapped in quiet recollection and steady warmth, you settle deeper into rest, knowing that memory like fire can be managed. Too much consumes, too little leaves the dark too empty. Tonight you have found the balance, and it carries you onward through the remaining hours. Sleep takes on a different texture now. It's not the deep drifting kind you might expect at home. It is lighter alert at the edges, shaped by the cold pressing patiently from all sides. Dreams arrive, but they are thin and close to the surface. You move through them aware in some distant way of the cabin around you. You dream of walking familiar ground, though it feels altered. Paths are shorter, landmarks blur, sound is muted just as it is outside the cabin now. These dreams do not pull you far away. They hover nearby, easily abandoned if the fire pops or the wind shifts. Men who wrote about winter sleep often described it this way, as if rest never fully closed its eyes. You wake briefly when a log settles in the hearth. The sound is soft, almost polite. You do not move. Your body remains warm enough. That is the test. If warmth holds, you stay. If it slips, you respond. Tonight it holds. Your mind drifts again, half dreaming, half listening. Images form and dissolve without story. A hand on a door latch, snow falling straight down, firelight moving across a wall. These fragments appear often in cold weather sleep according to scattered personal notes, though no one ever seemed sure why. Perhaps the brain holds on to what feels relevant even while resting. There has never been a single explanation for how the cold shaped dreaming itself. Some later readers thought the discomfort sharpened dreams. Others believed exhaustion dulled them. Lying here, you experience something quieter. Dreams feel thinner, closer to waking thought, less immersive than usual. Your breath remains steady beneath the blankets. Each exhale warms the small pocket of air you have created. The blanket rises and falls gently. This movement anchors you. Even in sleep, the body continues its careful work guarding heat without instruction. Outside, the night deepens further. Inside, time loosens again. You cannot tell how long you have been resting this way. Minutes and hours lose distinction. This sense of floating time appears in many winter accounts, described simply as nights that felt both long and short at once. You stir slightly as a colder draft brushes your cheek. The movement is automatic. You tuck your chin down, sealing the gap. The draft disappears. You do not fully wake. The body solves the problem on its own. This kind of learned response kept people alive more often than conscious thought ever could. Sleep thickens again, though never completely. You hover in that middle state where awareness fades but does not vanish. The cabin remains present in the background, steady and familiar. Fire, wood, breath. Each sound is known now. Eventually even the dreams thaw out. Thought slows to sensation, warmth, pressure, stillness. You rest without images, without memory, letting the night pass through you rather than carrying you away from it. When you wake again later, it will be because something has changed. Until then, you remain suspended in this quiet, watchful sleep, shaped by cold but not defeated by it, held gently within the narrow comfort the cabin provides. You wake without knowing why, and for a moment you cannot tell how long you have been asleep. The cabin is darker now, if that is possible, the fire reduced to a faint orange suggestion rather than a source of light. The quiet feels heavier, as though the night has settled deeper into itself. You lie still, letting awareness return slowly. This kind of waking was common in winter shelters, mentioned casually in personal notes as something expected rather than troubling. Men learned not to panic when sleep broke unexpectedly. Waking did not always signal danger. Often it simply meant the body was checking conditions, making sure nothing had shifted too far. You test the air with a careful breath. It feels colder but clean. Your fingers are still warm enough. Toes respond when you move them slightly. These small checks reassure you more than sight ever could. You do not rush to sit up. Rushing wastes warmth and clarity. From this low position, the cabin feels different. The ceiling seems closer. The walls feel farther away. Without light, space becomes something you sense rather than see. Snow has likely buried the window entirely by now. The outside world feels sealed off, distant, reduced to pressure and silence. You listen closely. No wind, no movement. Just the faint tick of cooling wood and the soft whisper of your own breath beneath the blankets. This deep stillness was often described as the coldest part of the night. Without air moving, cold settles and pools. It becomes denser, more present, but also more predictable. Some winter writings suggest these hours before dawn were the hardest to endure. Others describe them as strangely peaceful once the body adjusted. Lying here, you understand how both impressions could exist. The cold is closer now, but nothing feels unstable. You shift one shoulder, slightly adjusting the blanket edge. The movement is slow measured. You wait as warmth rebuilds in the spot you disturbed. It does gradually. Patience is rewarded here. A small note scribbled in the margin of a trapping ledger mentions men waking in these hours simply to listen, as if sound itself could confirm survival. You do the same now. Everything sounds as it should. Nothing new intrudes. Your thoughts remain minimal. There is no urge to plan or remember. This hour does not invite reflection. It invites endurance. You rest within that understanding, letting the body hold what warmth it can without interference. The fire stirs faintly, a quiet crack as an ember shifts. That sound feels significant, not because it demands action, but because it confirms continuity. Heat has not vanished entirely. The system still functions. You remain where you are, resisting the impulse to move closer to the hearth. Movement would cost more than it gains. Staying still is the wiser choice now. You know this without needing to reason it through. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension of waking eases. Your breathing deepens again. Muscles soften. Awareness fades back toward rest. This waking was not a warning. It was a check-in. Satisfied, you allow sleep to return lighter than before, but steady, carrying you through the quietest stretch of the night as the cabin and the cold hold their careful balance. You sense the night beginning to loosen its hold, though nothing visible has changed. It is not lighter yet. The cabin remains dim and enclosed. Still something feels different. The cold no longer deepens, it steadies. This subtle shift tells you more than any clock could. Men who lived by weather rather than hours often noticed this moment. Long winter routines taught them that the cold reached its strongest point before easing slightly toward morning. The change was small, almost theoretical, but bodies noticed it. Muscles relaxed just a fraction. Breathing felt easier. The night stopped pressing forward. You lie still and let that easing spread. The blankets feel heavier now, not because they gained weight, but because your body no longer resists them. Warmth stabilizes rather than slipping away. You do not rush to sit up or check the fire. There is no urgency. The system you built during the night has carried you to this point. A quiet observation appears in one winter journal where a man wrote that mornings announced themselves first through sound. The fire cracked differently. Wood settled with a sharper tone. Snow outside compressed rather than shifted. You listen now. The cabin holds a slightly clear silence less dense than before. Your breath no longer fogs as thickly when it escapes the blanket's edge. That detail tells you enough. The cold remains, but it is no longer tightening its grip. You draw the blanket closer and rest your chin against the warmth beneath it. There is still no complete agreement about how accurately people could sense approaching dawn without light or clocks. Some argue experience sharpened awareness. Others suggest expectation shaped perception. Lying here, you know the distinction hardly matters. What matters is that your body feels the change and that feeling guides your choices. The fire responds faintly as you stir an inch closer. Embers glow more clearly now as if encouraged by the shift in air. You do not add wood yet. You let the moment pass without interference. Conservation remains the rule. Outside, the world remains hidden. Snow buries everything equally. Trails, trees, landmarks. Yet inside you feel orientation returning. The night no longer feels endless. It feels finite. You stretch your fingers slightly beneath the blankets, testing them. Sensation remains good. Toes respond easily. These small confirmations build confidence quietly. Morning tasks will be possible. Movement will not be a battle. A small but telling habit appears in several winter accounts, where men delayed rising till the cabin felt stable again even after waking. They waited for warmth to settle before asking the body to work. You do the same now, lingering in rest rather than forcing action too soon. Your thoughts begin to organize themselves again. Plans form loosely without pressure. Check the fire. Shake frost from bedding. Warm hands before handling tools. These steps line up calmly, waiting their turn. You remain still a little longer, enjoying this narrow window where survival has already been secured, but effort has not yet begun. The hardest part of the night has passed. The cabin stands. The fire lives. Your body holds warmth. When you finally move again, it will be by choice rather than necessity. For now you rest in that knowledge, letting the last stretch of darkness pass gently around you, confident that the night has released you, even if the sun has not yet arrived. You sit up slowly at last, careful not to break the warmth all at once. Morning has not arrived in any visible sense, but the cabin feels ready to be used again rather than merely endured. This change matters. Night demanded restraint. Morning will demand effort. You swing your legs over the edge of the bedding and pause, letting blood move gradually. The floor still holds the cold fiercely. You plant your boots and feel their stiffness ease as your feet warm them from the inside. This simple exchange appears often in winter routines rarely described in detail yet clearly practiced. Frozen footwear could turn a manageable day into a dangerous one. You stand and stretch just enough to wake your muscles without shocking them. The cabin answers with a soft series of creaks as if acknowledging the shift. Frost still traces the lower walls, thicker now in places, but it no longer feels threatening. It is simply evidence of the night you passed through. You move to the hearth and kneel, brushing ash aside. The embers respond quickly, brighter than before. That tells you the fire was well built. Winter records frequently show men taking quiet pride in mornings like this, when last night's choices made today easier. You add wood, carefully building flame without hurry. A small observation tucked into a trapping ledger mentions men warming their hands before touching metal tools, learning the hard way that bare skin and frozen iron do not mix well. You hold your palms near the rising heat, feeling sensation return fully, fingers flex easily now. Good. The light inside the cabin grows not because the sun has arrived, but because the fire has. Shadows sharpen, shapes regain clarity. You can see the window again, buried almost entirely, only a pale suggestion of outside pressing through. Snow has reshaped the world overnight. There has never been full agreement among later readers about how often cabins like this were reused season after season. Some accounts suggest many stood empty between winters. Others imply frequent return. Standing here you sense layers of use, scratches, smoke stains, worn floor patches. Someone has been here before you and likely someone will be here again. You turn back to the bedding and begin the slow work of shaking frost loose. Ice crystals scatter and melt near the fire. Blankets soften as they warm. This task is not rushed. Moisture left trapped would steal warmth later. The men who survived winter's longest learn to think ahead even when tired. The cabin feels larger now that you're standing. Not truly larger, but more manageable. You know its sounds. You know its drafts. Familiarity reduces strain. You no longer feel watched by the walls. They have proven themselves. Outside the silence begins to thin. Somewhere beyond the snow the world prepares to move again. You listen not expecting sound yet, but knowing it will return eventually. You finish tending the fire and step back satisfied. The night is now a memory rather than a presence. What remains is the work of the day, shaped by what you preserve through darkness. You take one last look around the cabin, noting what held and what needs attention. Then you settle into the quiet confidence that comes from making it through another winter night. Not comfortably, not easily, but successfully. Warmth spreads steadily now, and with it the simple understanding that this shelter, imperfect as it is, did exactly what it needed to do. As the fire grows stronger, you think briefly of those who never reached this moment. Not with dread and not with drama, but with a calm recognition of how narrow the margins truly were. Nights like the one you just passed did not forgive small mistakes. They absorbed them quietly, then revealed the cost by morning. Accounts from trapping territories occasionally mention men who failed to wake often without explanation or spectacle. A fire allowed to die too far. Damp bedding that stole warmth faster than expected. Boots frozen beyond use. These were not heroic endings. They were quiet outcomes of ordinary miscalculations. Survival here depended less on strength than on attention. You understand now how easily the cabin could have turned against you. A poorly banked fire, a draft left unchecked, a moment of panic that wasted heat. None of these seemed dramatic at the time yet. Together they shaped the difference between waking and not. Winter taught this lesson repeatedly without raising its voice. One short entry in a fur trade journal mentions a man found sitting upright near his hearth, hands folded fire cold. The writer offered no speculation, only noted the position and moved on. That restraint says more than analysis ever could. Loss was common enough to be recorded plainly without commentary. There is still uncertainty about how often such deaths resulted from sudden illness versus gradual exposure. Later interpretations have pulled in different directions, and the truth likely varied case by case. Standing here in the warmth, you know the distinction matters less than the outcome. In a place like this, the body reaches a limit, whether named or not. You glance again at the fire, steady and bright now. It feels reassuring, but you do not romanticize it. Fire saved lives, but it also demanded constant respect. Many winter shelters burned because someone asked too much of it too quickly. Survival always balanced on restraint. The cabin feels changed in daylight's approach. Not kinder, just clearer. You see where chinking has fallen away, where frost built thickest, where you slept warmest. These details will guide what you fix before night returns. Men who lasted multiple winters learn to treat each morning as preparation for the next darkness. You take a moment to warm fully, letting heat reach your joints and spine. Fatigue lingers, but it is manageable. This tiredness is honest earned. It tells you the system held, but only just. Outside, the snow remains deep and unforgiving. Whatever path you take next will demand effort and caution. But for now, you are standing breathing warm. That is the measure that matters. You do not dwell on those who fail to wake. You acknowledge them quietly, then return your attention to the present. Survival here was never guaranteed, only negotiated night by night. As the cabin fills with warmth and shadow retreats to the corners, you feel a steady gratitude, not emotional but practical. You did enough. The shelter held. The night released you. That understanding settles deep and calm, preparing you for what comes next and reminding you that every small choice mattered far more than courage ever did. You prepare to leave the cabin with the same care you used to survive it. Departure is not rushed. Nothing here rewards haste. You move deliberately, gathering what you brought, checking what you will need again. The warmth from the fire lingers in your clothes and skin, a temporary gift you intend to keep as long as possible. You pause at the door, hand resting on the rough wood, and take one last look inside. In daylight's first suggestion, the cabin appears smaller than it did at night. Less mysterious. Its flaws are easier to see. Cracks in the chinking, smoke stains on the ceiling, the uneven floor. None of these feel threatening now. They feel familiar. The cabin did not promise comfort. It promised survival, and it delivered. Men who trapped these regions often wrote of cabins this way as tools rather than homes. They were shelters you borrowed for a night a week a season. You respected them, but you did not sentimentalize them. Attachment could make you careless. What mattered was knowing when to stay and when to move on. A small note in a winter ledger mentions a trapper leaving his cabin door slightly ajar when departing, so drifting snow would mark how long it stood empty. It was a simple way to track return or to know if someone else passed through. You consider the idea, then close the door firmly. This place has done its work. It deserves rest. There has never been a single view on how attached men became to these shelters. Some accounts suggest cabins felt like lifelines, deeply personal. Others imply they were forgotten quickly once left behind. Standing here, you sense both. Gratitude does not require permanence. You step outside into the cold again. It feels different now. Sharper, yes, but less surprising. Your body understands it better. Breath fogs thickly in the open air. Snow stretches unbroken in every direction, smooth and bright in the growing light. The silence remains, but it no longer presses in the same way. You turn back once more and look at the cabin from the outside, half buried, low against the land, smoke thinning into the sky. It looks almost fragile from here, yet it held through the night. Many cabins like this disappeared within a few seasons, reclaimed by weather and time. Others lingered longer, patched and reused, until nothing remained but darkened logs sinking into the ground. You adjust your pack and begin to move away, footsteps crunching softly. The warmth you carry with you will fade, but the lessons remain. How to manage heat, how to listen, how to stay calm. These mattered far more than strength or bravado. As distance grows, the cabin becomes just another shape in the snow, then fades into the landscape entirely. You do not look back again. What mattered happened inside during the long hours of darkness. The night tested you quietly and without drama. You answered it with patience, restraint and attention. That was enough. You move on, carrying the understanding that survival here was never about conquering the cold. It was about cooperating with it, accepting its terms and making careful choices within them. With each step, the cabin recedes further into memory, not as a story to tell loudly, but as an experience held close. One winter night endured successfully. Now you can let the pace soften even more. The hardest part is behind you. The images of snow and wood and fire begin to blur gently, their edges rounding, as your mind drifts away from detail and toward rest. You no longer need to plan or listen closely. The cabin, the night, the careful choices have all done their work. What remains is a quiet sense of safety earned rather than given. Your breathing slows further. Thoughts stretch and thin, no longer demanding shape. Imagine the fire now as nothing more than a steady glow warmth without urgency. The cold exists somewhere far away, no longer pressing, no longer asking anything of you. The world feels still settled, patient. Your body rests fully. Muscles release what little tension remains. The weight of blankets becomes the weight of sleep itself, holding you gently in place. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to decide. Let the last traces of the cabin fade into calm darkness. Let the snow become silence. Let the night dissolve into a soft, even quiet that carries you effortlessly downward. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. The story has done what it needed to do. Sleep comes easily now. Sweet dreams.